My name is Debra Morgan. Yes, Debra Morgan. And no, not the one from that TV show. People ask like I picked the name for dramatic effect, but I didn't. I was 10 when my parents split up. That sentence sounds like a small thing until you unpack it. 10 is the age you still believe in simple fixings, like Band-Aids and apologies. And then suddenly, you learn grown-ups keep secrets that aren't meant to be fixed. My mother, Maria, got primary custody. If you asked me, then, whether she deserved it, I would have said yes without thinking. She had been the constant in my life. But a year after the divorce, she married Darren Rise, and that one choice rewired everything. Darren was charming in the way predators are, slow smiles, a voice that sounded like it knew how to make people feel important. And then he turned mean in ways that didn't look like rage at first. He knew how to bury the wreckage in plain sight. At home, the first signs were small. Slammed doors that became slammed dinners, the way Maria's laugh thinned, the excuses that crept into explanations. Darren told stories about having cancer to make people orbit him with sympathy. He used it like a key, opening doors to control. When I called him out, because at 10 you call out what feels wrong, he'd flash that same smile and then find a way to make my mother believe I was the one ignoring him. It was gaslighting with a bedside manner. One winter evening changed everything. My dad, Harry, lovingly loud, stubborn as a radiator, had come to visit. He noticed the bruises on Maria, tried to talk, and whatever conversation turned into a shove, then a shove turned into a fight. My dad hit Darren. He didn't plan it. It didn't look heroic in a movie sense. It was furious and human and raw. But the fallout was immediate and perverse. Because Harry had an explosive temper and a record of being volatile on paper, the system decided he was the danger. Darren walked away with his polished victim face on. My father was painted as the aggressor. The judge looked at the math, one angry dad versus the man who could stage sympathy with a cough, and custody didn't go in Harry's favor. So they packed up our life in New York and moved us to Florida. New York was a city that had felt like the size of my future. Florida felt like a place you could hide bad things under sunlight and humidity. I remember the drive. My favorite stuffed animal shoved into a travel bag, my dad sitting across from me at the station, waving through the window like a bad movie scene that would have a happy twist if only it were a movie. Maria promised it was for the best. She said Darren would change, or that staying would be safer for me. I wanted to believe her, because belief is cheaper than the alternative. Knowing your mother chose someone who hurt her. Leaving felt like being exiled without a crime. At 10, you learn quickly how to hoard memories like contraband. The smell of my dad's old sweater, the sound of the subway, the way my mother used to hum when she could afford to be herself. Those things became small rebellions I held inside me when Darren walked by with that practiced smile. That's the setup. My life became a study in small resistances, keeping my father's letters folded into my sock drawer, practicing phone calls to him so I didn't fumble when he answered, and learning to read the room so I could come home to a version of my mother that sometimes showed up and sometimes didn't. What was at stake wasn't just custody or geography. It was who I would grow up to be. Someone who forgave what she saw as weakness, or someone who remembered that people could choose to protect themselves and walk away from monsters disguised as lovers. Those 5 years felt like living in a house that had been redesigned around one man's temper. Darren rearranged more than furniture. He rearranged the rules. He decided who got to answer the phone, who got to sit where at dinner, who got to leave the house. He was always convenient in public, charming at the grocery, solicitous at school plays, the kind of man who knew exactly when to cough to draw attention away from what he'd just said. At home, he was a ledger. Small cruelties added up over months into bills we couldn't pay. My mother, Maria, became an expert at rationalizing him. She had reasons, or things that looked like reasons. Darren said his tumor made him forget things. He made her feel like a savior for staying. He convinced her she was the only one who could keep him together. If you asked her later why she clung to that, she'd say something about loyalty and vows and how stopping would make her a monster. To me, It always smelled of fear and self-preservation, dressed in saintly clothes. We fought constantly. My resistance was straightforward. I wanted to be with my father, Harry. I wanted sleepovers, backyard barbecues, the loud, embarrassing way he cheered at baseball. I wanted to go back to a life where family meant more than walking on eggshells. My mother would argue back, voice tinny and tired. He hit someone. That's dangerous. You don't understand. The word dangerous was a cudgel Darren used to lock doors. He was good at loopholes. When I asked to call my dad, Darren would insist he be in the room for safety. When I asked to visit my grandparents in New York, Maria would say the judge had been very specific about the relocation paperwork, or Darren would schedule tests for his condition on the day of the funeral. Sometimes she blamed the hospitals. Sometimes she blamed me for making things harder. Every excuse was a stitch in the fabric of acquiescence. During those years, I became fluent in a new language, how to laugh on command, how to make my sadness fit neatly into small private corners so it didn't spill out and give Darren something else to justify. I learned to inventory the house for exits, to time the microwave hum with phone calls so Darren wouldn't notice, to fold my father's letters into shapes that fit in the hem of my jeans. I worked at keeping my anger legal and portable. Anger felt like the only currency the grown-up world hadn't managed to devalue. My grandfather, Walter Morgan, Harry's father, died while we were in Florida. Walter had been the kind of man who taught me how to skip stones and how to sink my teeth into a PB&J without apologies. He was the kind of granddad who kept a stack of comic books under his chair and who laughed like he'd been taught that the world was mostly okay. I wanted to go back for him. I wanted to stand in that little church, watch men fold their hands, see my father hold his composure. Instead, I sat on the porch under a humidity-heavy sky while Darren coughed theatrically inside, and Maria told me with a face I didn't recognize that it couldn't happen. I do not remember much of the funeral's footage, only the way my father's voice sounded in the recording he left me afterwards, hoarse and raw and twice as loud as the cemetery had been. "They wouldn't let you go, huh?" he asked. I said nothing. Saying anything meant summoning a confrontation that would lead to a dozen new kinds of punishment. Saying nothing felt like another sacrifice. Grief has a way of being bureaucratic. You're supposed to file it, schedule it, present it in a neat box. Darren refused to let me file mine. There were other forfeitures. Promises made to me, visits, calls, court dates were threaded through with Darren's interference until they unraveled. Teachers called to say I was quieter, angrier. I found comfort in textbooks and thrift store novels, places where consequences were consistent and not contingent on someone else's manipulative script. I watched friends move through normal adolescent chaos. First dates, driver's permits, while my life felt like a project under perpetual renovation by someone who'd mistaken controllingness for care. I will not say he hit me. That was not my story. What he did, with more discipline, was erode the possibility of normalcy until I could scarcely remember the shape of it. He turned my mother into someone who could justify staying. He turned laws and small-town bureaucracy into shields for his theatrics. He taught me how adept adults are at convincing themselves of the version of the world that keeps them comfortable. But cracks happened. Small victories that felt seismic. A terse voicemail from my father that said he'd be at the bus station at midnight, if I could get there. A judge's temporary hearing that ruled Darren's medical needs required proof. Maria and Darren arguing so loudly one night that my bedroom window rattled. Those fissures let in light. They were not triumphs. They were hints that the facade had limits. By year 5, we were all exhausted. Darren and Maria stopped pretending as much in private. They began living like roommates who disliked each other's habits. He left his dishes, she left her words unsaid. Their fights became less performative, more bitter. The house smelled less like performance and more like spoiled food, the agreeable veneer rotting away. When Darren moved into a separate room, and then a different apartment, it felt like coming up for air and immediately realizing you were still underwater. Relief was there, but so was a hollow I hadn't yet learned to name. I was older now, tougher, angrier, and not at all reassured that justice had been served. Missing Walter's funeral had become a scar in my chest I'd touch sometimes when no one was looking, an ache that throbbed with every family photo I wasn't in. I kept thinking about small paybacks, how the cosmic scales imbalance when liars sleep easily. I rehearsed conversations where I told Maria exactly what she'd done, where I told Darren I had not lost my voice. Mostly, I rehearsed exits. The years had taught me patience and the ability to wait for the moment when the ledger might be settled, not in flash, but in stubborn, inevitable accounting. Halloween felt like a dare that year. Cheap plastic pumpkins, people in mask makeup laughing too loudly, a fog machine wheezing out embarrassment on the corner. I went because it was safer to be part of a crowd than to be alone in the house where memories had teeth. I told myself I'd be casual about it, that I'd pretend the past didn't coil under my skin every time someone said the word party. The dog, a mutt named Biscuit who thought he owned the neighborhood, had a way of finding me. He appeared at my ankle like a living excuse to breathe. That's when I saw him. Darren, headed down the sidewalk with Biscuit on a leash. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near our block, certainly not walking my dog. I froze because for a second my brain did the polite thing. It cataloged the oddness as possible coincidence. Then he looked up and the smile was the same one that had rearranged my childhood. Too calm, too measured, as if nothing heavy had ever lived even in his throat. I walked toward him because some part of me had been practicing confrontation in the mirror for 5 years. Practice is a strange religion. It promises second chances. "What are you doing with my dog?" I said, and my voice did a thing I liked. It didn't tremble. He cocked his head like a man hearing a joke in a language he didn't know. "I'm walking Biscuit," he said. "He likes me." "You're not supposed to be here." My words were sharper than I felt. They carried the crack of someone who had rehearsed boundaries until rehearsals hardened into bone. He moved the leash like it was an ornament, not a responsibility. He tried the old trick. Soft voice, the small fake cough about his condition, the way he always turned sympathy into armor. "We should talk, Debra. Your mother—" "You don't get to talk to my mother," I snapped. People on the sidewalk glanced up. Someone nearby laughed at something in a bowl. The ordinary world continued, which made everything feel both exposed and oddly safe. It escalated in that cramped, stupid way fights do when two people have been hoarding anger for years. He tried to step between me and Biscuit. Too close, a grin like a wedge. I shoved him. He pushed back. Then he did what he always did when losing control. He used his hands as if they were the only language left to him. I kicked him. Not cinematic, not a high-flying stunt, just the kind of instinctive, furious motion you make when something precious is endangered. Biscuit yelped and slipped the leash. For once, the dog was a free actor in our story, cutting between us like a blur of fur and joy. The shove rattled him. He staggered, more surprised than hurt, and that was the moment the streetlight made Maria's face into a thing I hadn't seen in years. Skinned raw and suddenly awake. She came out of the house like someone had lit a fuse under her. She'd never been slow when the real thing happened. Only slow when the pretense needed keeping. But that night, she moved with a readiness I'd only seen once before, when my father had lost his temper and the world voted him dangerous. Maria had a gun. I had known, in the way you know the weather is about to change, that she kept one. Something about keeping promises to herself and the old man she'd married once who'd taught her to make room for fury. I had never imagined she'd use it. She fired. The shot was a starburst in the quiet, sudden, loud, and the smell of burned metal immediate and ridiculous in the humid October air. The world contracted to the three of us. Darren, who went down like someone surprised by his own mortality. Maria, her hand trembling, and me, standing with Biscuit in my arms, feeling like a spectator who'd been pulled into the ring. Darren survived, not because mercy had been handed to him, but because the wound was not enough that night to finish him. He wheezed and swore and tried to make the incident into a new kind of performance. Wounds as proof of victimhood, the same script he'd used for years. The police came. Statements were taken. The neighbors offered versions that bent around loyalty and visible scars. My voice came out flat and certain when the detectives asked, the way someone who has spent years cataloging injustice can speak while the heart is busy refusing the lie. The immediate aftermath was a strange, slow unspooling. Maria was arrested. Someone had to answer for the bullet, but so was the history that bullet revealed. People finally looked at Darren the way my father had looked at him in that dim memory, like a man who had been allowed to build an alibi out of other people's sympathy. The prosecutors dug. Past reports were found, witnesses called. For once, the ledger that Darren had so carefully kept in public, charmed neighbors, tears at the right moments, a cough that sounded convincing, was no longer enough to excuse private cruelty. The trial did not feel like satisfying justice. Trials are loud with lawyers and legalese. Revenge does not cleanly equate to accountability, but accountability arrived in its slow, bureaucratic way. Darren was sentenced for the pattern of violence, for the assaults people had been too tired or too scared to formalize before. When the sentence was handed down, the word guilty sat on a page and had the weight of something final. He killed himself in prison. The news came with the same hollow certainty that bad things sometimes have. They make themselves small and final on a press release. I remember the way my hands went cold reading the headline, as if the world had clipped off the end of a sentence and left me with a fragment. People expected me to feel triumphant or tormented. The truth sat somewhere quieter. Relief that the man who had shaped half my childhood into a lesson in endurance no longer existed in the same way those lessons do. A numbness at the finality of it all, and an odd, bitter amusement that the man who had weaponized sympathy had finally been disarmed by the system he'd learned to manipulate. Revenge, when it happens, rarely looks the way you imagined. It is messy and legal and hypocritical, and sometimes driven by someone else's hand, by my mother's decision to stop being collared by fear. There were consequences. Maria had to answer to prosecutors, to a court of jurors who had never seen the slow erosion of a marriage from the inside. She faced a judgment that measured the right to protect against the law's insistence on proportionality. Friends took sides. My father's phone calls were a mix of fury, relief, and that particular brand of parental bewilderment that can barely contain gratitude. I learned how public moments calcify private pain. I learned how silence can become a shield. When I stood in the hallway outside the courthouse for the hasty moments after testimony, the October sun felt like an accomplice, warm and indifferent. People passed, costumes still half on from the party, and somewhere in the city, someone else was laughing. Someone else was crying. The ledger had balances, and it had entries, and for the first time since I was 10, there was a line that read, "Not my fault." It didn't erase the years. It didn't bring my grandfather back. It did something else. It stopped us from pretending that the past was a closed loop. It opened a new page, ragged and honest, and I found myself ready to write on it. I live with my dad now. It's been years since that night in Florida, but sometimes when I feed Biscuit his breakfast, I still catch the faintest echo of that Halloween air, sticky, electric, and waiting for something to snap. The house Harry and I share is small, quiet, and blessedly uneventful. My dad talks too loudly when he cooks. He plays Sinatra on a loop. He still oversalts everything. It's not perfect, but it's peaceful, and peace was once a luxury item in my life. Harry never gloated about being right. He could have. Plenty of people did that for him. But when Maria called him from the hospital after Darren's death, he just said, "You did what you had to do." And that was that. No sermons. No analysis. Just a simple acknowledgement from a man who'd once been punished for trying to protect the same woman. He forgave her before I even managed to. That's the thing about my father. His anger burns bright but never long. Mine burns steady, a pilot light that hums but never goes out. Maria lives nearby now, in a one-bedroom apartment that smells like lavender and old decisions. We talk, awkwardly, sometimes tenderly. She's in therapy, something she used to call self-indulgent nonsense. Her face looks softer these days, as if the tension finally left her bones. I see in her a woman who survived her own lies. That doesn't make her innocent, but it makes her human. I don't hold grudges anymore, not because forgiveness is noble, but because carrying that weight feels like continuing his work. People ask if I feel guilty about Darren, about what happened to him. I don't. The man lived on borrowed pity and counterfeit charm. He used cancer as a currency, cruelty as a leash. There's no tidy moral here, no divine justice, just human cause and effect. Darren built a trap and fell into it, the way arrogant men always do when they believe they can outsmart the truth forever. I do feel something else, though. A strange gratitude for the endurance he unintentionally trained into me. Because surviving him means I can survive just about anything. I don't flinch when people raise their voices. I don't mistake apologies for change. I don't let anyone tell me who I'm supposed to be grateful to. I'm 24 now. I study criminal psychology, which feels poetic in a way I try not to admit out loud. My classmates talk about deviance like it's a lab specimen. I talk about it like a ghost that sometimes wears a smile. Harry jokes that I'm trying to become a professional mind reader. He says it like a tease, but I think he's proud. Sometimes I drive past the old courthouse, the one where Darren's sentence was read. The building's bland and bureaucratic, as most American justice is, but the sight of it makes me feel oddly steady. Like a monument to what happens when the truth finally stops being polite. And in quiet moments, late night, mug of coffee, biscuit snoring on the couch, I realize that revenge was never the end of my story. It was just the punctuation at the end of someone else's. What came after was simpler, smaller, but more important. The slow, deliberate act of living without fear. That's the real closure, not his punishment. Not even Maria's awakening. Just the fact that I can breathe, sleep, laugh, and know that no one in this house pretends pain is love anymore.